Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon in some places where you are watching this evening. My name is Ron Ferguson. I am the clerk of the General Committee of Friends Committee on National Legislation, and it is my privilege to welcome you to this meeting this evening. First of all, I want to thank those who have already participated in the Quaker, the QPPI, Quaker Public Policy Institute. It has been a busy and rewarding 3 days thus far. Now we welcome you to the opening session of FCNL's 2021 annual meeting. We would encourage you to put in the chat where you are joining us from this evening. We would be glad for that to keep track of all of this. And we also then want to encourage you to enter into a time of waiting worship as we wait for the program to officially begin this evening. The psalmist in Psalm 133 wrote these words, "How good and pleasant it is when brothers and sisters dwell together in unity. It is as refreshing as heavy dew on a desert mountain." We would like to encourage you to enter into this time of waiting worship. That's a perfect description of a gathered friends meeting for brothers and sisters to dwell together in unity. It's why we're gathering this year for annual meeting. And so we would encourage you to enter into this time of waiting worship to allow the dew of God's presence to refresh your soul as we begin this important and momentous annual meeting. Let's enter into worship together. Thank you, friends, and thank you once again for joining us for this opening session of annual meeting. Our General Secretary, Diane Randall, will now introduce our evening speakers. Diane?
Thank you, Ron, and welcome everyone. I'm really pleased to offer my words of welcome to you at this General Committee annual meeting where we are gathering virtually. It has been already 2 very busy days for us at the Quaker Public Policy Institute, and we're grateful that so many of you joined us to lobby for the Build Back Better plan. We started this morning with a real sense of joy when the Build Back Better plan passed the House of Representatives. It is a historic and transformational piece of legislation that still has a ways to go because it still has to go to the Senate. So we believe that your advocacy will be instrumental in helping us move that forward. This afternoon was a different story when we heard the verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse case in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Heartbreaking, grievous, and perhaps not unexpected. So it is with a sense of anticipation and a sense of hope that I look forward to this evening's program. I'm grateful to be with you in that time of waiting worship, and I am especially pleased to introduce to you Vanessa July as our plenary speaker this evening. Vanessa is a Quaker who carries a ministry within the Religious Society of Friends and beyond. She has engaged European American friends to recognize privilege and the culture of white supremacy that we live, work, and often worship in. She also ministers to friends who are people of color through convening worship and other forms of support and engagement. In the ways that we as friends watch one another for how we live into our spiritual selves, I have observed Vanessa's spiritual presence as a teacher, an elder, a companion, and a person of wisdom. You may know Vanessa as co-author with Donna McDaniel of Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, a seminal book for friends and others in understanding Quaker and religious history relative to African Americans' enslavement, abolition, as well as more recent history in the last century. Vanessa has written for Quaker publications, Quaker pamphlets, and been featured on Quaker Speak, a video series that tells the stories of living Quakers. She is often asked to speak at Friends schools. Earlier this year, she gave the Stephen Carey Lecture at Pendle Hill as she called Friends to be part of a blessed community. Vanessa works for Friends General Conference as the director for the Committee for Nurturing Ministries focusing on racism and youth ministries programs. She is a member of Central Philadelphia Monthly Meeting, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, the Fellowship of Friends of African Descent, Quakers Uniting in Publications, Ujima Friends Meeting, and the Ujima Friends Peace Center. In 2002, Central Philadelphia Monthly Meeting wrote a travel minute for Vanessa's Travel in the Ministry, in which they wrote, "The overall vision of Vanessa's ministry is to help humanity remember its wholeness." This evening, we are also joined by Aisha Imani. She is one of the founding members of the Ujima Friends Peace Center and the Fellowship of Friends of African Descent. And Aisha will offer libations as we begin our gathering tonight.
Peace and blessings, friends. It's generally our tradition to ask permission from the elder to begin. And in lieu of that, we ask permission of the community to begin. And I'm hoping that we have that permission. And if that permission is given, normally the affirmation that is said is Ashe. So I hope that I can see and hear, and Diane is shaking her head. And so I'm going to interpret that as Ashe. The point of our libations is an African ritual that we do at Ujima Friends Peace Center. And I am going to pour water, which is a symbol of life, into this plant, which is a symbol of life. And hopefully it will help us to remember that we are part of the continuity of life, and to remember those who have come before us, and to remember those who will come after us. And so first and foremost, and as I pour and I say Ashe, I'm hoping that you will say Ashe wherever you are. First want to pour this libation in gratitude and recognition of the Creator known by many names through time, by many people. Ashe. Want to pour libation for that source of all life and all love and all peace and justice and joy. Ashe. Want to pour libation for Africa, the cradle of civilization and the motherland of us all. Ashe. It is difficult for our hearts not to be heavy tonight as we ponder the decision in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. And so I want to especially remember tonight those who have lost their lives as they stood against injustice, stood against racism, stood against white supremacy. So I want to pour this libation in honor of the life of Octavius Cato. Ashe. Want to remember the life and the sacrifice of Viola Liuzzo. Ashe. Want to remember the sacrifice and the life of Stephen Biko. Ashe. Want to remember the lives of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. Ashe. Want to remember the life of Medgar Evers. Ashe. Want to remember both Herbert and George Lee. Ashe. Want to remember Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Ashe. And now we remember the lives of Joseph Rosenbaum and Anthony Hubert. Ashe. And as we remember those lives, let us also remember the lives of those who were not, their lives were not cut short. And they had to see these injustices, but just continued to fight and carry the banner against injustice. And so we want to remember the example of Fannie Lou Hamer. Ashe. And Ida B. Wells. Ashe. We want to remember the example of Bayard Rustin. Ashe. And Ella Baker. Ashe. We want to just ask for the strength and for the resilience and the commitment to live lives that will honor our ancestors came before us. Ashe. We want to remember our personal ancestors who were not famous but loved us before we were. Ashe. We want to remember those generations yet to come and remember our responsibility to do all that we can to make this world more just than we found it. Ashe. And we want to affirm this organization and the work that it continues to do in the world. And may we find ways to hold it up, both spiritually and with our support. Ashe. We ask that our ancestors would be pleased with this libation and with our efforts to make this world a better world. Ashe. And we finally ask that our Creator will be pleased with our lives and our testimony as we try to stand for peace and justice in this world. Ashe. Ashe. Ashe.
Thank you very much, Aisha, for calling in our ancestors through the pouring of libations. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Diane Randall, Friends Committee for National Legislation's General Secretary, for inviting me to give the keynote address at this year's annual meeting, and Quaker Public Policy Institute, whose theme is Choose Hope, Work for Justice. I will begin our evening with giving honor to the Lenni Lenape tribe of Pennsylvania, where I live. This is a practice that I have been doing for several years. It is my way of acknowledging that the land on which I live and work was stolen from the Lenni Lenape people. This is especially important to recognize, given that next Thursday we will be celebrating the 400th anniversary of the myth of the first Thanksgiving between the Wampanoag people and the Pilgrims. For the most part, Thanksgiving itself is a day of mourning for Native people, not just Wampanoag people, according to Tim Turner, Cherokee, manager of Plymouth Plantation's Wampanoag home site and co-owner of Native Plymouth Tours. In their Aboriginal language, Lenape means true men and original people. They're called the original people because many of the traditions of the Algonquin Indian tribes say the Lenape homeland was the original birthplace of the Algonquin Indians. So the Lenapes are referred to as their grandfather tribe by various other tribes. The Lenni Lenape tribe is made up of 3 groups called clans. These clans are the turtle, wolf, and turkey. They're a part of the Algonquin people of the Anishinaabe tribe of southern Canada and northern United States. The Lenni Lenape are matrilineal, which means that every member traces their descent through their mother's lineage and not their father's. The Lenni Lenape tribe, also referred to as the Delaware Indians, are caretakers of the land called Lenapehoking. This land expanded all the way from northern Delaware to southeastern New York, and from the Atlantic Ocean to the forest in eastern Pennsylvania. They acquired the name Delaware Indians from English colonists in the Delaware Valley. The Europeans forcibly removed the majority of the Lenni Lenape tribe westward in the 1700s. Those who remained, fearing the persecution suffered by their contemporaries in the American Indian community, generally kept their ancestry as a well-guarded secret. The colonization of the Lenni Lenape tribe and their removal from Lenapehoking is at the root of how the American colonies were born. I'm going to share with you their standard land acknowledgement written by the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation to honor the Lenni Lenape people and territory preceding events in Lenapehoking. The land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape called Lenapehoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation, the Ramapo Lenape nation, and the Powhatan Lenape nation. the Nanticoke of Millsbury, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief, Tamanen, that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. To get a better understanding for the destruction colonization caused and why Thanksgiving is a day of mourning for Native people, I would like for us to watch this video of the map depicting the theft of Turtle Island's original indigenous homelands over the centuries from 1776 to the present. We will sit in silence for a few minutes and feel the loss of the indigenous population of Turtle Island. Okay. Can they hear me? Okay. I'm very sorry. It is actually embedded in my slide, but what clearly didn't translate when I sent it over. So I apologize for that. So then we'll then now go on. So now I want to give honor to my ancestors. There are three I lift up tonight during my liberation ceremony. My seventh great-grandfathers from Turtle Island, Thomas Pinn and Indian Charles. Thomas Pinn was born into the Wicomico tribe in Wicomico Parish in Lancaster and Northumberland counties, Virginia. Indian Charles of the Nanticoke tribe lived across the Rappahannock River from the Portabago Reservation in what is now known as Caroline and King George County, Virginia. And my third great-grandmother, Leah Warner, from Guinea. I am honoring them because it is their lives and their spirits that are my foundation. I literally would not be here today without them, and I couldn't sustain my ministry without their examples. They, and many of my other ancestors of African and indigenous descent, encountered and survived white supremacy generations before me. In order to survive, the Pinns, like other indigenous people, were assimilated into European culture through the Episcopalian Church, resulting in them losing their indigenous language, cultural practices, and names by being given Christian surnames. Young Indian Charles watched as the adult members of his tribe were taken from their village and sold into enslavement to the island of Antigua, West Indies. The Nanticoke tribal children were distributed by lots to the members of Virginia's Governor's Council. These indigenous orphans were by law enslaved until they reached 25. Indian Charles, along with the other Nanticoke tribal children, was indentured. Leah was 12 years old in 1830 when she was kidnapped and shipped from Guinea to Bermuda. U.S. Congress outlawed the African slave trade, making it illegal for enslaved Africans to be brought to the United States. So they were first taken to Bermuda and then sold as Caribbean enslaved in South Carolina. Leah was given her Christian surname when she was sold to a man of German descent, Robert Frederick Ruth, in Beaufort, South Carolina. Leah's children watched as she was sold on the auction block by their white father to a plantation on Hilton Head, South Carolina. Then, while Leah watched, her children, Daniel and Leah, were sold on the auction block in the front of her and taken away from the plantation. The strength that my ancestors showed in persisting with building lives that would produce and support children illustrates the solid foundation on which my family is built. During those times when I feel that I have reached my breaking point, I rely on that foundation, calling out to those ancestors to share their strength with me. I invoke them tonight for their support in bringing you my message. I am here tonight to confess that many of our systems are not serving us well. We are living through a tumultuous time where we are experiencing a global pandemic, globally extreme and historic wildfires, floods, increasingly intense and numerous tornadoes in areas that traditionally have not experienced them before, global drought, and more frequent and severe global earthquakes. Our climate is changing more quickly than scientists expected. Our Earth is transitioning underneath our feet. Are we listening to her? I would say that the majority of us are not. We want our lives to return to what many of us call normal, a normal that is based on a capitalistic system centered on material commodification, replication of extractive techniques as a form of economic development for European nations and based on a system of assets with land and labor being the key commodities. A white, dominantly controlled structure designed to oppress by skewing the availability of resources in favor of white people. Colonization and capitalism are the root of our major global problems today. Racism and white supremacy have been established as our system of power. White supremacy, racism, colonization, and capitalism are all systems being implemented internationally. These systems were created by European countries to build their economies and reserves. Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain all had a role in colonizing several continents, including Africa, the Caribbean, and Turtle Island. When I learned about history in school, it was something for which I was detached because it happened a long time ago before I was born, and it was not representative. The only thing I learned about African Americans was that we were enslaved and that the Civil War was fought to free us from enslavement. At that time, I did not know my Indigenous ancestors. They remained hidden from me until I was an adult, when my cousin Anita Wills identified them through her research of our family. In actuality, my Nanticoke and Wicomico ancestors were physically present, represented in the faces, cultural practices, and beliefs of my family members, hidden in plain sight. In school and through American culture, I learned Turtle Island was a vast uninhabited land that was waiting to be exploited for its bountiful resources. The indigenous tribes of this land served as an obstruction to that goal, so needed to be contained and/or removed. What role have Friends had in the establishment of white-centered system? How did we get here? It is important to understand the large role that religion has had in the foundation of the American empire. The church is at the root of colonization, capitalism, and white supremacy. It has been complicit in bringing Western civilization to the rest of the world. We will begin examining this foundation through the Crusades, a series of religious wars initiated by Pope Urban II between Christians and Muslims, started primarily to secure control of holy sites considered sacred by both groups. There were 8 major crusade expeditions that occurred between 1096 and 1291. During these wars, Muslim Moors were considered less human than the Christian soldiers. Continuing with this examination, we come to the 15th century, where the Doctrine of Discovery was established. It was a series of papal bulls giving European Christian colonizers the right to take land and other resources and to convert or kill non-Christian inhabitants. There were 3 papal bulls that occurred between 1452 to 1493. They supported the credence that non-Christians were considered enemies of the Catholic faith and, as such, less human. Pope Nicholas directed King Alfonso to capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to put them into perpetual slavery, and to take all their possessions and property. The Doctrine of Discovery is the seed of white supremacy, colonization, and capitalism. It gave Europeans the right to colonize both Africa, the Caribbean, and Turtle Island, implementing the commodification of land and people, making them all property through state-sanctioned structural violence. Friends used the Doctrine of Discovery to build their empire. Quakers have been instrumental in the colonization of Africa, Barbados, and Turtle Island. Friends used the Doctrine of Discovery to participate in the colonization of Barbados, where they appropriated land for their sugar plantations. In her book, Christian Slavery, Conversion and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World, Catherine Gardner states that the largest community of Quakers outside of the British Isles was in the slave and sugar-rich island of Barbados. According to Gardner, Anne Austen and Mary Fisher were the first Quaker missionaries to arrive in Barbados in 1655. They attracted planters, merchants, and craftspeople to join them in Barbados, where enslavement was accepted into these Friends' convictions and practices. Friends profited from the shipping industry that carried enslaved Africans from Africa to the Caribbean and Turtle Island. They invested their money in banks and insurance companies, supporting ships that transported enslaved Africans as cargo to the Caribbean and Turtle Island. Quakers also profited from being shipbuilders, owners, captains, traders, and financiers. There was a broad range of merchants involved in this industry, from the blacksmiths and the block makers who fitted the ships, the sail lofts and rope walks who prepared canvas and rigging. There were also the caulkers who scraped and sealed hulls, and finally the carpenters that built the shelving below decks where the enslaved Africans were shackled. Other merchants not directly involved with the ships provided products that were used in the purchase of enslaved Africans, such as rum made by distilleries sealed in barrels produced by coopers, candles, cloth, and iron bars produced by factories and foundries, as well as beef, flour, tobacco, and onions, all grown and produced by farmers. Every single one of them built their foundation of wealth in the United States of America on the enslavement of Africans. The 1845 Manifest Destiny philosophy, which drove the westward and southern invasions, held that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and share democracy and capitalism throughout the North American continent, dispossessing indigenous tribes of their collective sovereign land, supporting European invaders' sense of entitlement and practice of accumulating wealth from stolen people on stolen land. It was believed to be both justified and inevitable. There was the sense that white people were God's chosen instruments to civilize the US and the world. According to Robert P. Jones, author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White American Christianity, this policy grew out of and was based on that doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery continues to manifest itself in the lives of indigenous people today. In 2004, the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma and Anadarko filed a lawsuit against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This Delaware Nation based its lawsuit on the doctrine of discovery and the royal charter that King Charles II of England issued to William Penn in 1681. In the preamble of Penn's charter, King Charles II speaks of the charter's purpose and Penn's alleged intentions, which were to enlarge our English empire, to provide useful goods, and to civilize and Christianize the savage native. That charter gave William Penn sovereignty over land that had not yet been colonized and dominated by Christendom. Some of you may know that William Penn's son, John, Thomas, and Richard illegally expanded their father's territory through what is referred to as the walking purchase. The walking purchase expanded Penn's original colony by tricking the Lenni Lenape into giving up a large portion of their territory by creating fraudulent documents which allowed them to legally steal a portion of the Lenape Nation's land. This 2004 court case concerned those fraudulent documents, and though the court recognized in its ruling the illegitimacy and fraudulency of the walking purchase, they ruled that the indigenous tribes did not have any right to the land in the first place. Indigenous peoples, or quote unquote savage natives, had the legal right to occupy land, but no right to own it. Also, in 2005, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited the landmark 1823 decision in City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York. The ruling held that the repurchase of tribal lands did not restore tribal sovereignty. Indigenous people, along with the World Council of Churches and several Friends meeting, continue to fight for the doctrine's revocation. As you can see, the doctrine erected barriers between Europeans and people of color by calling some Christians humans and non-Christians non-human, creating the legal, religious, political, social, and economic ethical framework that justified white superiority, establishing the devastating pattern of natural resource extraction, enslavement, forced labor, separating families, and genocide. These violent patterns of dehumanization created systems of oppression that were established and are maintained by fear and massacre. My ancestors endured the governmental removal from their ancestral lands, separation of children from their parents, enslavement, and cultural genocide through assimilation. What are the roots of African descendants' experiences within Quakerism in the Caribbean and the United States of America? As stated earlier, Friends owned, sold, traded, and captured enslaved Africans. Quakers considered enslavement necessary for their economic development. Friends established regular meetings for worship for people of African descent for only those who they enslaved in 1675 in the West Indies after George Fox's visit to the island. Initially, Africans and people of African descent were not allowed to become members of the Religious Society of Friends until 1784. Worship for African descendants took place in separate meeting houses, or if they were invited to worship in a meeting house with people of European descent, they were placed in segregated sections in the back or balcony during the 18th and 19th centuries in the United States of America. Friends were good about donating money and their time to establish schools for people of African descent. However, for the most part, were hesitant to admit children of African American descent into Quaker schools. This is expressed in the words of Samuel Ringgold Ward, who escaped on the Underground Railroad to become an abolitionist. Ward stated, "The Quakers will give us good advice. They will aid in giving us a partial education, but never in a Quaker school beside their own children. Whatever they do for us savors of pity and is done at arm's length." Changes have occurred within the Religious Society of Friends since the 17th century. It was not until the middle of the 20th century that Friends admitted students that were not of European descent in the majority of their schools on the East Coast. Now, people of African descent can become members of Friends meetings. We can sit wherever we choose in meeting houses, and our children are educated in Quaker schools alongside white children. However, barriers remain in Friends communities. Robert P. Jones, in his book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, talks about a foundational Christian structure practiced among Friends. It would not be unusual for white slave owners to bring enslaved people to church with them on Sunday mornings. Whites would sit in the front and enslaved people would sit in the back. That context certainly shapes the way Christian theology and practice is formed. You're not going to preach a lot of liberation, freedom, and equality from the pulpit. You're going to preach more about obedience to the master and fulfilling your roles, those kinds of things. I think that fundamentally distorted American white Christianity from the beginning. This Christian practice generated barriers invisible to many and thus more difficult for them to see. These barriers are the system of white supremacy that provides greater access to power and resources for people of European descent. The system that tells us this behavior is normal, encouraging us to support it by being complicit and not question the patterns of how we live our daily lives. Jones states, "There's this tension between doing nothing to upset anyone, which is what white churches have often done, and having the skill and leadership to lead people on a journey. Christianity is supposed to be a journey, and it's not supposed to be a comfortable journey. Christian life is supposed to be a challenge. Part of that challenge is how we've let our conceptions of race and racism seep into our theology and infect it. He also says, we've done damage to our own faith by allowing white supremacy to seep into it and be a presumption of the kinds of theology and practices that can be developed. Gerbner talks about the Friends who colonized Barbados' need for labor to make money from the sugar plantations. Earlier, I stated there was a large Quaker presence on Barbados. Thousands of Friends inhabited the island. In the 1670s, it was called the Nursery of Truth because it was so filled with Quakers. 80% of those Quakers in Barbados owned enslaved Africans. Many of us know that in 1671, George Fox traveled to the island where he urged Quakers to consider manumission, but he did not call for an end to the practice of enslavement. Fox commended Friends to worship with the enslaved people in their households and to introduce Quakerism to them. When Pennsylvania was founded in 1682, William Penn and others used their Quaker connections in Barbados to purchase enslaved Africans. As Pennsylvania's social and economic structure developed, ties with the West Indies and other trade channels flourished. The trade with Barbados was a source of pride and a symbol of prosperity for many English Quakers who considered enslavement to be necessary for economic development. Also, colonists from Barbados relocated their wealth, enslaved Africans, and pro-enslavement ideologies to William Penn's new American colony when they settled in Pennsylvania. Gerbner reminds us that whiteness was created in order to legalize and justify inequality. She further states that this history invites us to think about what it really means to combat oppression. This also means confronting the uncomfortable aspects of Quaker history. When we relegate the blame for slavery and oppression to people in the South, for example, we're actively erasing Quaker complicity in and support for enslavement, not only in Barbados, but also in Philadelphia and elsewhere in the North. This is an uncomfortable past, but it's a past that needs to be brought into the light. Looking carefully at this Quaker past can teach us a lesson about social justice. It shows us that it's not enough to be radical. We also have to be vigilantly aware of history and the complexities of inequality. It's not enough to have good intentions. We must be critically engaged with the past to understand the influence it continues to exert in the present. For centuries, Friends of African descent have been telling us that normal is damaging. Friends Journal published my article titled An Online Lifeline for Friends of Color. As a result of this global pandemic, several Friends of Color have left their predominantly white meetings. I wrote, in the midst of such despair and turmoil, our collective trauma, exhaustion, sadness, and anger have increased. As we checked in with each other after worship that week, and up to the writing of this article, more Friends of Color have expressed the importance of the People of Color spaces Friends General Conference, FGC, is providing. Friends of Color are finding it harder to be in predominantly white environments, including our Quaker meetings, because they are no longer feeling nurtured in those environments. The larger society is making it clear that not only are we not considered human, but we are definitely not considered Americans. Now that I have done this research and have a better understanding of our full history, I see why friends of African descent continue to be affected by racism in the religious society of Friends today, and hope you have a better understanding too. Our ancestors have left us this system. It is going to take specific actions on our part to dismantle those systems and create a more equitable world. Change will come only with deliberate attention and effort. Because the issue is so broad, it is not possible for any individual or any single organization to possess all the capacities and resources needed to achieve racial equity. Friends of color and of European descent need to examine our practices and, with the guidance of friends of color, decide which ones are essential aspects of the religion without members of the Religious Society of Friends of European Descent established and have controlled Quakerism since its inception, even though the majority of Quakers in the world today are friends of color. These friends are located in the global South and have limited financial resources. The French church there was established by missionaries and remains closely controlled by those Quakers of European descent. A part of that control has involved inviting people of color to join the religion on their terms. People of European descent have made the decisions for people of color in the Religious Society of Friends for over 300 years. It is time to co-create a religion that reflects all of us. Addressing racism in the Religious Society of Friends is as turbulent as ending enslavement was for our community. Sadly, that process took 100 years. A practice of enslavement because so many of them were involved in the economics of enslaving Africans. It took many years and a change in leadership for this attitude to transform. Daniel Hill, in his book, White Awake, An Honest Look at What It Means to Be White, says, the transformation of sight is often a painful process, just as all true growth is. White people tend to confuse comfort with safety, but it is rare that these situations are actually unsafe. They're uncomfortable because we aren't accustomed to that level of discourse. When you engage with difficult topics, as we are doing right now, you develop a more muscular approach to staying engaged. Hill also says, an increased understanding of our present and of our history ushers in discomfort. Learning to respond in a healthy way to the internal chaos aroused by our awakening is an important step forward. American culture tends to hide the stories of guilt and shame and seeks to elevate stories of success, which result in amnesia about a tainted history. This practice is exactly why Donna McDaniel and I decided to research and write Fit for Freedom. We wanted to disrupt our normal white culture by presenting a publication that shared the full history of the relationship between Quakerism and African Americans with all of its complexity. I'm thankful for the opportunity to dispel the myths generated about this relationship. However, I knew that Fit for Freedom was going to be a difficult book for some friends to read. The information we were discovering was hard for me to digest as an African American, yet it explained so much. I wondered if European Americans would retreat into their white fragility, or would they be resilient? I can say that more friends were resilient than I expected. I want you to have the vision to see things differently. Be open to listening in new ways and understand things outside of the context of white culture. Your goal should prioritize flexibility. Step outside of your white cultural boundaries. Test yourself constantly to see how flexible you truly are. When you feel your white fragility surfacing, notice it, let it pass through you, and take the risk of making a different choice. Instead of defending your intention, apologize. Let go of your defensiveness and focus on how your actions have impacted others, regardless of how good your intentions were. It is time for all of us to truly begin living our testimony of equality, or what I prefer, equity. We must build a religious society of friends where everyone feels welcome for who they are. One that does not cause people to leave a major part of themselves or their cultural identity outside the door. Let's begin to identify and separate the aspects of Quakerism that are not related to the core of our beliefs, the non-essential Eurocentric practices that have become attached to the way we practice our faith. Just as we talked about from white supremacy. Once those are removed, we can together, people of color and of European descent, rebuild Quakerism and the world into an equitable and peaceful home. For us to begin this journey of work for justice, it will be important for us to know and understand our own individual cultural heritage. We also need to have an honest understanding of how our ancestors contributed to this world and the structure of white supremacy, how we continue to maintain vestiges of the structure in our behaviors today. It is only possible to change a system once you have a clear understanding of how it operates. Acknowledging the pain and celebrating the accomplishments will help us be able to transform members of the religious society of friends and eventually the inhabitants of the world into peaceful human beings. Awareness of white supremacy is not static. It is a process. We all are someplace in this process, and everyone benefits when we grow. Center voices the global majority and lived experience. Decolonize one's mind from accepting whiteness as part of normalcy. Co-create alternative paths for acceptance, reflections, and actions. Move beyond diversity and inclusion to racial representation, create alternative power structures, practices, and accountability. We will need to lean into our testimonies of simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, which I alter to equity, and stewardship, as our meetings feel like a soupy mess during our process of examining our structures, determining which ones hold us up and which ones no longer serve us because they hold us back from co-creating our new structures. This process may take longer than expected for us to emerge from, but when we do, we will be a stronger religious society of friends for doing that messy work of transformation together. Let us change our pattern of relating with one another to one that honors freedom, equity, integrity, and peace. Speak to that of God in each person and honor our mutual humanity. The legacy of white supremacy within all of us, and it is going to take all of us working together to remove the barriers it has constructed and preserves. As descendants of the Religious Society of Friends, whether by blood or conviction, we are responsible for repairing the harm that this religious society implemented through our role in rooting our religion in colonization, capitalism, and white supremacy. We need to be accountable for the heritage of our religion. It is time for the Religious Society of Friends to openly share the truth about how we acquired our resources, which help maintain the oppressive systems and structure established to acquire and uphold Quakerism. It is time for us to provide restitution, repair, and justice for the spiritual, cultural, and economic harm perpetuated by Friends. There are some Friends meetings and organizations that are working on restitution, repair, and justice by examining their practices and policies, which is resulting in restorative action through economic redistribution and repairs. The work, although messy and painful, is being transformative. Friends know that change will not happen if we continue to make the same white-centric choices. Two of these Friends institutions are Friends General Conference and Green Street Monthly Meeting. Friends General Conference, FGC, established the query, how does this decision support FGC in its goal to transform into an actively anti-racist faith community? The organization is being more consistent with using this query to question decisions made by its employees, committees, and board. Friends General Conference also established two funds. The Baird Rustin Fund is to support people of color's travel costs to FGC-sponsored meetings and other activities, while the Mahala Ashley Dickerson Fund is intended to provide broad support for anti-racism work, including defraying the cost of people of color's registration fees for Friends General Conference sponsored meetings and other activities, as well as supporting program development and staffing. In the past few years, the organization has implemented several free virtual programs for people from the global majority. About 3 years ago, Green Street Monthly Meeting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, established a reparations committee. They see reparations as economic and spiritual repair for the intergenerational harms of slavery, Jim Crow, and their afterlives. It is spiritual work intended to address the theft and pillaging of Black wealth for 400 years. In May 2021, Green Street Monthly Meeting committed to devote $50,000 a year for a total of $500,000 over 10 years towards reparations for the Black community of Germantown, where the meeting house resides. The community is also providing in 2022 a legal clinic project to protect and secure Black wealth through the distribution of Green Street Meetings resources to stabilize Black home ownership. The Reparations Committee hopes it is one step on their pathway to offer and work for reparations to and with the Black Germantown community. The Black members of the Reparations Committee, in consultation with Black members and attenders of the meeting, are holding authority and responsibility for determining priorities for their work. They see this as a beginning, but hopefully others might feel called to join them with support. For them, it is a deep spiritual commitment, and it is enlivening their community as they work in relationship with Black Germantown residents. If you would like to connect with Green Street Reparations Committee, their email is greenstreetreparations, all one word, @gmail.com. These friends, among others, have taken up the call to work for justice. They are using some of their economic foundation to accumulated wealth, resources, and energy attained from stolen land, stolen resources, and the exploitation of people's labor, recognize the harm that colonization continues to perpetuate and develop systems for the reallocation of some of that wealth. I know that the Religious Society of Friends has the faith and trust to choose hope to co-create a transformed religious community where everyone unconditionally works for justice within and outside of Quakerism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa. Very, very powerful message for us, both the history of your own personal experience, as well as the history of what you have learned and researched, and the challenge to us as the Religious Society of Friends, and to us as a Quaker organization, and to us individually. So thank you very much for joining us tonight and sharing your story and this story and ministry of work that you've been doing. We're going to turn to an opportunity for us to consider what Vanessa has shared with us tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to Jim Kaysen, who will be explaining what the next part of the evening will look like as we move forward this evening and finish our last part of the program and look forward to 2 more days together at our annual meeting.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Vanessa, for this evening, for the beginning of this evening. As we were planning this session, we knew that there would be much for us to reflect on from the presentation and this keynote speech that we heard today. And recognizing the importance of this message, we have arranged now to transition to worship sharing offered by affinity groups. We invite you to follow the appropriate Zoom link and join your worship sharing group. You can find these links at fcnl.org/AM schedule. And I know that's going to be put into the Zoom chat, into the YouTube's chat now. We're going to go ahead and get started in about 5 minutes. There'll be worship sharing leaders in those sessions, and we are blessed to have queries that Vanessa July has provided for us to help center our worship in these groups. So I invite you to join us for worship sharing tonight. And after the worship sharing tonight, I hope you'll get some rest and then come back tomorrow at noon Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific, for our opening plenary address. We've got a lot to do tomorrow as well in terms of the governance. And if you want to start a little early, some of you have been really enjoying the Fellowship of Coffee with Friends that begins an hour early. But now our work is to go into worship sharing groups, and I invite you to join us for the worship share.